Hello, I'm Bernard Hickey from interest.co.nz and welcome to another in our series of double shot interviews where we bring a minister or a chief executive into the interest.co offices and grill them for about 10 minutes on anything we think might be interesting: interest rate policy, economic policy, tax policy, lots of exciting things like that. And today we have Peter Dunne with us again, the Inland Revenue Minister and the leader of the United Future Party, just to get an update on what's happening with tax issues around the economy, property tax, GST changes, these sorts of things. Welcome in,
Thanks,
Peter.
Ben. It's good to be back.
Good. Last time we spoke, you were looking at transitional arrangements for the GST change in October. What's happened since then?
Well, since then, the GST Advisory Panel has looked at a number of quite tricky issues and has recommended some changes, which I've now got through Cabinet. I've announced those today. Essentially, they relate to matters that sort of overlap the 1st of October, so like lay-by payments, some categories of insurance payment, other payments in that nature where you've got a transitional period and where the GST is applicable and where it's not. Basically all pretty user-friendly, cost the revenue about 35 million to implement, but a cost that's got to be met because they are sorting out some anomalies. What it's shown, though, is quite an interesting thing, that the level of institutional knowledge that we assumed was in the system from the time of the last GST change in 1989 simply isn't there.
Where's it all gone?
A lot of people have moved on. The way in which we store records these days has changed. So we've had a much bigger job than I think we anticipated in terms of getting over some of those transitional arrangements where what might seem to be obvious solutions have to be worked through and achieved. So these ones I'll have in legislation which will go through the House in the next few weeks.
Can you give us an example of where you've had to tweak things to make sure it was fair?
Well, let me give you the obvious example of someone who lay-buys goods for Christmas. They might make a monthly payment of 12.5%, or whatever it is, tracks the 12.5% GST. Given that the supply isn't until after the change in the rate, do they pay 15% for the whole year, or do they pay 12.5% up until 1 October and 15% thereafter? The position will effectively say that if you've entered into the contract, that's deemed to be the point of supply, so that you'll make the change at 1 October. Because otherwise you could have argued that they should be paying 15% right back from the time of entering the contract until they pick it up. So changes like that, which you might think are mechanical, but actually have quite a big impact both on the industry concerned, but also, in this case, the purchaser.
You're confident we're going to get all these things done and dusted before October 1?
I am. The GST Advisory Panel is still receiving matters, but it's confident that it's got the major ones out of the way. And as I say, legislation to give effect to those changes that I've just announced will be passed by the end of August. I've announced it now to give people time to make the adjustment. It's still very tight. It's still under 2 months only, but if we waited until it was passed, it would be getting around to about 4 or 5 weeks, which is just too tight in a number of cases.
We'll put some details in the story underneath this video for people to click through for all of the details on that. The property tax changes announced in the budget, in particular the issues around LAQCs and QCs. Last time we spoke, you said that there was some consultation going on there. What more can you say about how far we've gone?
The consultation is still going on, and there is a lot of discussion taking place internally about the scope of the changes. Are there unintended consequences? Can these be mitigated? Or are, in fact, we're looking at a broad brush approach? The changes in the budget were all predicated around changes to property investment. And so, again, as we look through the whole LAQC issue in particular, it's about the impact on property investments. But we've got to be very careful we don't bring a whole lot of other people who are unintended consequences, I was going to say, into the net. So that's what we're trying to work our way through. We're still on time to have decisions made in the latter part of the year and hopefully into legislation around November.
Your feeling in recent months about that? Is there any big fish hooks that have come out of it?
I don't think there are big fish hooks. There's certainly a much more intense debate than we might have appreciated when we last spoke. But that's been quite good because it's forcing people to start to confront the issue and what it is precisely we're trying to achieve. In many cases, qualifying company regime, perfectly legitimate. The LAQCs had a particular function. We want to make sure that that's not being misused by effectively moving to treat for tax purposes the mall as a form of partnership arrangement. Again, logical, but we just want to make sure we don't catch the unintended through this process.
What's the scale of the issue here in terms of how many people were using LAQCs to invest in property, and how much is at stake in terms of tax that might be made or not gained?
Certainly a significant growth in the use of LAQCs since the 90s. Quite a significant revenue issue there. Breaking down, though, what's property related and what's not is just proving a little bit more challenging, but we still think there's a substantial issue there to be resolved. But as I said, we've got to be careful that in dealing with that, we don't also hit a number of other unintended consequences.
Any specific unintended consequences that have come out yet?
Well, just various examples of arrangement that are not property related but could well be caught by these changes. Various business arrangements that on the face of it seem perfectly legitimate and proper and unlikely to be leading to avoidance.
Any other industries that are being
I've talked to people in tourism. I've talked to people in a range of other industry sectors who say, hang on, this affects us. Transport, for instance. So it's a matter of just working through the issues and the consequences and how they are affected in the regime. What I'm saying, though, is we were very clear when we started that we were looking predominantly at what we saw as the misuse of LAQCs, and again I'm using that word quite deliberately, in the property investment sector. That was the mischief we were seeking to remedy. In doing so, we want to make sure we don't replace that mischief with a whole lot of other mischiefs.
The property tax changes are out there, they're sort of going through the market now. What impact is the government seeing on the housing market and the economy from those tax changes?
Well, you've seen a number of reporting statements made from various companies reporting a loss in profitability. All of that, I think, was in the realm that we were predicting. We expected that to be the case. You're certainly hearing anecdotal reports of a slowing in the price of residential property. Again, I think predictable. At this stage, the government doesn't see any of the news that is coming forward as unexpected or cause for concern. It's obviously a situation we'll keep an eye on, but at this stage, basically things are panning out pretty much as we expected. We don't expect that sort of immediate downward effect to be long term, and we expect it will be that sort of the first shift, and then things will gradually recover after that. But no cause for great concern at present.
The government's reviewing the rules around land ownership. As the United Future Party leader, what's your view on whether we should allow foreign companies to own New Zealand land?
There are two aspects to this. I think that the idea that land is some sort of a strategic investment is a little bit hard to swallow, because you can't pack it up and take it with you. On the other hand, I think that the issue of farmland in particular is different, because I think there's a certain iconic value to a lot of that. There's a certain sense of sort of family and ownership around land in a way that there mightn't have been, for instance, with something like the Auckland Airport when that was up. So our view would be to draw a distinction between the ownership of the foreign ownership of farmland, and particularly its agglomeration into certain blocks, and other investment opportunities that come along. And again, the Auckland Airport example was a classic where we wouldn't have had too much of a difficulty with the Canada Pension Fund buying into that. We might have more of a problem with aggressive agglomeration of farmland.
I'm trying to work out what's different between land and a bank or a media company or an airport.
There are a lot of issues, I think. Public access is an important part of that. Maintaining that opportunity for people to get out there and enjoy, particularly the high country. I don't think you can make an equal claim for public access to the airport land around Auckland Airport, for instance.
Well, wouldn't the laws be the same for any owner?
Well, it's making sure those laws are enforced. I think also there is an issue of opportunity for New Zealanders, particularly to develop that land, which I think is different again from an airport or commercial situation. But it's a fraught area, and I think at the end of the day what the government has to do, any government has to do, is just work through where the level of public tolerance is. We have a very effective free trade agreement with China, and every day you hear good success stories coming out of it. What's important is we don't push that to the point where people start to say this is not a free trade agreement, but effectively a one-sided takeover. The sort of story I heard last week where a local business that I visited told me, great, we think the free trade agreement is great because we've been able to purchase machinery for our business at a considerably lower cost than other sources of supply because of the free trade agreement. Well, that's positive, and that's the sort of thing we've got to enhance.
But the Chinese wouldn't allow us to buy their land, would they?
And this is the quid pro quo. We have a very liberal land acquisition regime and compared to other countries. And so I think we've got to probably just look afresh at that and see where we draw the line to make sure that we're not, if you like, giving away too much of what some might describe as our birthright, bearing in mind you couldn't do the same thing in China or elsewhere.
What's your feeling on where the government might go? You're very close to the government.
Well, I think the government's review of the overseas investment arrangements is proceeding more slowly than, I don't mean in a pedestrian sense, but it's not at the advanced level that some people think it's at. I think there is concern about where you draw the line, effectively. The government clearly is committed to promoting foreign investment. I am too. But it's a matter of where you draw that line in such a way to ensure that some of the things that New Zealanders might regard as part of their tradition and their heritage are protected and aren't simply sold off and then locked up for use by those who don't allow us to have the right of access that we might have thought we once had.
What about the argument that you could sell at high prices to foreigners, wait for them to lose money and then buy it back off them cheaply, in the same way that the Americans did this with the Saudis and the Japanese in the 70s and the 80s?
Well, you could take that view. The question is how confident you would be in its outcome. And as I say, the issue for a lot of New Zealanders is a much more emotive one. And I think the government's got to work through a fairly delicate balancing act here. On the one hand, this is not and shouldn't become an argument for banning all forms of foreign investment or all forms of foreign ownership of particular either resources or pockets of land. At the same time, I think the concern a lot of New Zealanders have is about farmland and about what they see as sort of part of our birthright being sold off. I think you can work out a compromise, but it's going to take some pretty deft footwork, and I think that's going to be the challenge for government as it just goes through the process.
Because there's a risk too that if you take away the foreign buying, you also reduce the prices.
That's right, and you also reduce the perception that this is a country that's worth doing business with. So there are a lot of factors in this, but as I say, I think there is a way you can work an acceptable compromise that broadly balances out all the issues.
The government and the Inland Revenue is a close observer of what's happening in the economy. What are you seeing as the Inland Revenue Minister in terms of receipts coming in, GST receipts, income tax receipts? How's the economy travelling?
Well, the economy has been moving along at a fairly steady sort of plateau, if you like, for the last few months. It hasn't been, in my view, deteriorating. It hasn't been strengthening as much as some might argue either. The latest set of figures that I've seen tends to confirm that sort of bouncing along approach. What will be interesting to see over the next little while is whether there's a perceptible uplift or whether we continue about where we are at the moment. We're no worse off than we were this time last year. We're not a huge amount better off. Now, again, put that into an international perspective, and probably that would put us reasonably well positioned in terms of where a number of other countries are at, for reasons that are obvious. But there's no cause for complacency, and it's certainly not crack the champagne bottles at this time.
Do you think the government's doing enough with fiscal policy to fix any problems?
I think the government's been fairly prudent in its approach, and I think that it's a matter of some patience and just making sure that we let what flowers of recovery are starting to bloom prosper before we sort of stifle them.
Just finally, the Labour Party has come out with suggestions of a change in monetary policy. What's your view on whether we should change the Reserve Bank Act?
I don't think that that's a serious stand from them. I think it's very populist. I think it's missing the point, and I think it's just a bit of political desperation. I think that in terms of the way the Reserve Bank Act operates alongside the Fiscal Responsibility Act and the Public Finance Act, they are the pillars on which our monetary and fiscal system is founded. And I think it would be very foolish to start to tamper with them. Every review that we've undertaken under both Labour and National-led governments of monetary policy and the Reserve Bank Act has come out and said uphold the framework. I find it rather strange now that the Labour Party suddenly says, oh, look, we're just going to change it all because we think that different instruments are needed. Well, they haven't worked in the past, and I don't think they'll work now.
Peter Dunne, the Inland Revenue Minister, thank you very much for another double shot interview. I'm Bernard Hickey from interest.co.nz.